She stood in the freezing smog, a multi-limbed outcast clutching her starving child, begging for scrap work while the galaxy walked by. They saw a monster. Arthur just saw a broken mother who needed a break. Sometimes humanity isn't about conquering the stars. It's about opening the damn door. The air in Sector 4 always tasted like burnt hair and oxidized copper. It was a flavour Arthur had grown so used to over the last 20 years that clean oxygen would probably make him gag. He was 54, his lower back was a knot of inflamed nerves, and his knuckles were permanently stained with black synthetic grease that no amount of industrial solvent could scrub away. He stood behind the grimy plasteel window of his repair shop, Arthur's Salvage and Drive, nursing a chipped mug of synth-caff. The liquid was lukewarm, tasted vaguely of battery acid, and did nothing to clear the fog in his brain. Outside, the primary concourse of the station was a chaotic blur of moving bodies, neon advertisements bleeding into the grey smog, and the relentless, low-frequency hum of the atmospheric scrubbers failing to do their job. Through the streaked glass, Arthur watched her. She was an alien, a refugee from the Rimwood colonies. Arthur didn't know the exact name of her species. People on the station just called them ticks or scrappers. She was tall, maybe pushing 6.5 feet if she stood up straight, but she was hunched over, her posture screaming a kind of exhausted defeat that transcended biology. Her body was segmented, wrapped in a naturally hardened pale grey carapace that looked pitted and scarred. She had 4 primary arms, the lower 2 clutching a ragged oil-stained thermal blanket to her chest. Inside that blanket, Arthur could see the faint rhythmic twitching of something small. A child. She was going door to door. Arthur watched as she approached Davis's intake bay across the street. Davis was a loudmouth, a heavy-set human who overcharged for plasma regulators and bought stolen goods on the side. Arthur couldn't hear the words, but he didn't need to. He saw the alien raise her upper hands, palms exposed in a universal gesture of supplication. She was begging for work, not credits. Work. Arthur had seen her kind before. They had a cultural pride that made outright begging for charity abhorrent to them. She wanted to earn her survival. Davis didn't even let her pass the threshold. The heavy-set man stepped out, his face red, shouting. He shoved her. The push caught her on the shoulder, hard enough that her segmented legs scrambled on the slick metal grating to keep her balance. She didn't retaliate. She just lowered her head, tightened her grip on the bundle in her lower arms, and backed away into the mist. Arthur took another sip of his terrible coffee. He felt a familiar, ugly twist in his gut. "Not your problem, old man," he muttered to the empty shop. The sound of his own voice was gravelly, dry. He turned away from the window, walking back to the dismantled fusion manifold sitting on his primary workbench. He grabbed a torque wrench, the cold metal heavy and familiar in his hand. He tried to focus on the stripped threads of the casing. He had rent due in 4 days. The corporate overlords who ran the station didn't care if business was slow. If he didn't make quota, they'd repossess his tools, lock the blast doors, and vent his remaining oxygen into the void just to save a few fractions of a credit. He wrenched a bolt. It squealed, a harsh metal-on-metal screech that set his teeth on edge. He couldn't afford to care. Empathy was an expensive luxury on Port Meridian. You start bleeding for every stray dog and starving refugee that washes up on the docks, and pretty soon you're bleeding out right beside them. He had his own problems. His joints ached with the changing atmospheric pressure. He was tired. He just wanted to fix this manifold, sell it to a passing freighter, and buy a bottle of real rye whiskey to numb his spine. Then the rain started. It wasn't water. It was the station's condensation runoff, a toxic yellowish drizzle laced with sulfuric acid and industrial runoff. When it hit the Durasteel pavement outside, it hissed. Arthur closed his eyes. He squeezed the handle of the torque wrench until his knuckles popped. He listened to the hissing rain. He tried to count the beats of his own heart, trying to drown out the sudden intrusive image of the grey-plated alien standing in that downpour. Clank! He threw the wrench onto the bench. It skittered across the metal, knocking over a tin of spare bolts. He swore, a long vicious string of profanities directed at Davis, at the corporate board, at the station, and mostly at himself. He marched back to the front window and wiped away the condensation with the sleeve of his coveralls. She was still there. She hadn't moved to the transit hubs or the lower slums. She was sitting on a rusted transit crate directly across from his shop, wedged beneath a shallow overhang that offered almost zero protection from the acid rain. The yellow droplets were sizzling against her pale carapace, leaving faint smoking marks. She was completely curled over the thermal blanket, using her entire body as a shield for her child. Her forearms were locked in a cage around the bundle. Arthur's chest felt tight. It wasn't a heroic swelling of the heart. It was a suffocating, deeply annoying realization that his conscience was going to override his common sense. He hated it. He hated that he couldn't just look away like Davis. He hated that the universe was so relentlessly cruel. And he hated that he was about to make his own miserable life marginally harder. He didn't put on a coat. He just slammed his hand onto the door release. The heavy rusted door groaned, the hydraulic hinges screaming in protest as it slid open, letting in the sharp, acrid stench of the rain. Arthur stepped out into the biting cold. The yellow drizzle immediately stung his scalp and the back of his neck. He crossed the street, his heavy boots splashing through the oily puddles. As he approached, the alien flinched. Her large, compound eyes, deep pools of fractured black glass, flicked up to him. There was no hope in them, just a numb, bracing preparation for another blow, another shout. She tightened her grip on her child. Arthur stood over her, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his grease-stained coveralls. He looked down at the smoking pits on her shoulders, where the acid rain had eaten into her shell. "You speak Terran Standard?" he asked. His voice was loud, rough, competing with the hum of the station and the hiss of the rain. She stared at him for a long moment. Then, a vocal apparatus somewhere in her throat clicked and whirred, before producing a heavily accented, raspy voice. It sounded like dry leaves scraping over stone. "Yes, I speak." "You looking for a handout or you looking for work?" Arthur demanded, his tone deliberately flat. He didn't want to sound kind. Kindness gave people false hope. Her antennae, slick with rain, twitched upward. "Work. I can fix, sort, clean. I learn fast. Please." Arthur looked at the bundle in her arms. The blanket shifted, and for a second he saw a small pale face. Soft, unhardened chitin. Large, frightened eyes. The child looked impossibly fragile. "What do I call you?" Arthur asked. "My designation translates poorly. Grinding stone. Unpleasant for human ears," she rasped. "The intake officers, they called me Ruth. It was easier for their screens." Ruth. A good, old-fashioned name for a widow lost in a foreign land. The irony wasn't lost on him. "All right, Ruth," Arthur said, turning his back on her and pointing his thumb over his shoulder toward his open shop door. "I got a mountain of fused copper wiring in the back that needs stripping. It's tedious, it's filthy, and it pays garbage. Minimum wage under the table. You get a break when your hands bleed and not before." He didn't wait for her to answer. He started walking back across the street, the acid rain burning the tips of his ears. For a terrifying second, he heard nothing behind him. He thought maybe he'd insulted her. Maybe the pay was too low. Then he heard the frantic, wet scraping of claws on metal. He glanced back. Ruth was following him, moving with a desperate, hurried limp, shielding her child against her chest. She wasn't walking. She was fleeing the abyss, rushing toward the dim, yellow light of his shop as if it were a dying sun. Arthur stepped inside, hit the door release, and let the heavy metal seal them in. The noise of the street vanished, replaced by the humming thrum of the shop's portable heater. He had just hired an alien refugee. He was officially an idiot. The shop was a mess, a graveyard of forgotten technology and broken promises. Piles of servos, shattered optical sensors, and rusted hull plating were stacked haphazardly against the walls. The air smelled of old dust, ozone, and the sharp tang of metal polish. Arthur walked to the far corner of the room, near the rattling industrial heater. He kicked a milk crate out of the way and pointed to a massive pile of insulated wire. It was a tangled, ugly mound of salvage from a decommissioned hauler. Stripping it by hand was the worst job in the shop, mind-numbing, finger-shredding labour. "Sit there," Arthur ordered, not looking at her directly. He was suddenly acutely aware of how small his shop was, how invasive it felt to have another living, breathing thing in his space. "Tools are in the yellow bin." Ruth stood awkwardly by the door. The acid rain was evaporating off her carapace, filling the room with a faint smell of sulphur. She looked around the shop, her black compound eyes reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights overhead. Slowly she moved toward the heater. She didn't sit immediately. Instead, she gently lowered the bundled child to the floor, placing him directly in the path of the warm air blowing from the grated vents. Arthur pretended to be busy at his workbench, but he watched her out of the corner of his eye. She peeled the thermal blanket back. The child, a boy, Arthur assumed, though alien biology wasn't his strong suit, was small, maybe the equivalent of a human 5-year-old. His carapace was soft, almost translucent white, lacking the hardened grey armour of his mother. He was shivering violently, his small chest heaving with shallow, ragged breaths. "What's his name?" Arthur asked gruffly, grabbing a rag and violently wiping grease off a perfectly clean wrench. "Sammy," Ruth said softly. Her lower hands hovered over the boy, adjusting the blanket with surprising tenderness for limbs that ended in hardened, 3-fingered claws. "The immigration officer named him. Said it sounded friendly." "Friendly?" Arthur scoffed, shaking his head. "Right, because immigration officers are known for their warm hearts." Ruth didn't reply. She settled onto the floor next to the pile of wire, her legs folded beneath her in a complex, multi-jointed sequence. She reached into the yellow bin and pulled out a pair of wire strippers and a heavy utility knife. Arthur watched her, expecting clumsy movements. Her species was built for strength, judging by the thick plates of armour. He assumed fine motor skills would be an issue. He was wrong. Ruth's upper 2 arms held the thick insulated wire taut. Her lower left hand manipulated the wire strippers with terrifying precision, snapping them closed around the rubber casing, while her lower right hand used the utility knife to slice down the seam in a single fluid motion. She peeled the rubber back and tossed the gleaming naked copper into a separate pile. Snip, slice, peel, toss. It was a rhythm. It was a machine-like efficiency born of desperate focus. She didn't pause. She didn't look up. Her 4 hands worked in a synchronized dance that a human could never replicate without years of cybernetic augmentation. Arthur stared for a full minute before realizing his mouth was slightly open. He snapped his jaw shut, feeling a strange mix of vindication and deep embarrassment. He had hired her out of pity, expecting her to be a burden, a charity case he'd have to tolerate for a few days before letting her go. Instead, she was tearing through the scrap pile twice as fast as he ever could. "Don't dull my blades," he muttered, turning back to his fusion manifold to hide his face. An hour passed in heavy silence. The only sounds were the howling wind outside, the rattling heater, and the steady snip-slice-peel from Ruth's corner. Arthur's stomach gave a loud, hollow growl. He checked the digital clock on the wall. 1300, time for his usual pathetic lunch. He walked over to a small, grease-stained mini-fridge tucked beneath a shelf of chemical solvents. He pulled out a plastic container of cold, synthetic noodles swimming in a dark, salty soy substitute. It was cheap, it was filling, and it tasted like salted cardboard. He grabbed 2 plastic forks from a drawer and walked back to his bench. He popped the lid off. The smell of the synthetic soy hit the air. From the corner, a sound broke the silence. It wasn't Ruth, it was Sammy. The child had stirred, pushing himself up on weak, trembling arms. His large, dark eyes were locked onto the plastic container in Arthur's hands. The boy let out a soft, high-pitched clicking noise, a sound of raw, unadulterated hunger. Ruth immediately froze. Her 4 hands dropped the wire. She reached out, gently but firmly pushing the child's head back down beneath the blanket. "Hush," she whispered in her raspy voice. She looked at Arthur, her posture rigid with fear. "I apologize. He's undisciplined. It will not happen again." Arthur looked at his cold noodles. He looked at the starving alien child. He looked at the mother, who was staring at him as if expecting him to strike her for the child's insolence. Arthur felt a sudden, profound exhaustion wash over him. He hated this. He hated the vulnerability. He hated the reality of poverty that stared him in the face every day. He was a cynical old bastard who had spent decades building up a tough exterior so he wouldn't have to feel things like this. With a heavy sigh, Arthur grabbed a clean, empty solvent tin. He poured half of his noodles into the tin. He walked over to the corner. Ruth recoiled slightly as he approached, her upper arms rising instinctively in a defensive posture. Arthur ignored her. He crouched down, his bad knees popping like firecrackers. He set the tin of noodles and a plastic fork on the floor right in front of Sammy's face. "I don't like eating alone," Arthur lied, his voice gravelly and flat. "And I overordered. If he doesn't eat it, I'm throwing it in the recycler. So, make yourself useful." He stood up, groaning as his back protested, and walked back to his bench before she could say anything. He didn't look back, but he listened. He heard the rustle of the blanket. He heard a soft, hesitant scraping of the plastic fork against the tin. Then, he heard the frantic, wet sounds of a starving child eating faster than he could chew. A few moments later, Arthur heard Ruth's voice. It was barely a whisper, trembling and raw. "Thank you, Arthur Pendleton. Thank you." Arthur stabbed his own noodles with unnecessary force. "Don't thank me. Just strip the damn wire. We're on a schedule." He took a bite of the salty cardboard. For the first time in years, it actually tasted pretty good. 2 weeks bled away into the grey haze of Port Meridian. The station didn't change. The smog was still toxic. The neon signs still buzzed with failing capacitors. But inside Arthur's salvage and drive, the tectonic plates had shifted. It wasn't a loud transition. There were no sweeping declarations of equality. It was just the stubborn, quiet rhythm of work. Ruth was a revelation. Once she burned through the mountain of copper wiring, Arthur tossed her a fused plasma torch regulator. He expected her to ruin it. Instead, her 4 hands danced. She didn't just rebuild it, she tuned it. Her species possessed a microscopic sensitivity to electromagnetic fields. She could literally feel a live circuit through the sensory hairs on her forearms. She wasn't cheap labour, she was the best mechanic he'd ever had. They worked in the heavy, shared silence of grease and scorched metal. Arthur grunted, pointed at a busted hyperdrive coil, and Ruth dismantled it. Sammy changed too. The shop's heat and a steady diet of the synthetic protein bars Arthur accidentally dropped on the floor worked miracles. The boy's translucent shell hardened into a healthy mottled grey. He stopped shivering. Soon, he was clicking around the shop floor on 4 little legs, hoarding dropped washers and stripped screws to build intricate, shiny nests in the corner. "Keep his junk out of my walkway," Arthur grumbled, stepping carefully over a tiny pile of blue fibre optics. But he never swept the nests into the recycler. The piece shattered on a Tuesday. The air was thick with the smell of burning flux when the shop chime spat a harsh electronic buzz. Arthur was under a dismantled nav console, wrists deep in frayed wiring. "Yeah, hold your horses," Arthur yelled, wiping a streak of black grease from his forehead. Heavy, impatient boots struck the metal floor. "I ain't got all cycle, Pendleton." Arthur sighed, his bad knee popping as he slid out from under the console. He recognized the voice, and the overpowering stench of cheap synthetic musk that preceded it. Miller. Miller was a mid-level haulage captain for a corporate subsidiary. He had fleshy jowls, rings on every fat finger, and a habit of treating everyone below his tax bracket like dirt. He was also one of Arthur's only consistent paying customers. "What do you need, Miller?" Arthur asked, grabbing a rag. "I fixed your thruster manifold last week." Yeah, well now my starboard grav plate is whining, Miller complained, leaning his bulk against the counter. Need a replacement coupling, cheap. Miller's eyes roamed the shop. They skipped over the diagnostic screens, the shelves of parts, and landed dead in the corner near the heater. Ruth sat there, quietly resoldering a circuit board. Sammy was beside her, clicking 2 brass cogs together. Miller's face contorted. Disgust rolled off him in palpable waves. What the hell is that doing in here? Arthur stopped wiping his hands. The rag went completely still. She works for me. A tick, Miller sneered. His voice was loud, carrying a nasal, grating edge. He took a heavy step toward the corner. You let a giant cockroach touch my engine parts, Arthur. No wonder my ship runs like garbage. Probably laid eggs in the exhaust. Ruth stopped working. She didn't look up, but Arthur saw her shoulders lock. She slowly pulled her forearms inward, shrinking her profile, trying to erase herself from the room. Sammy dropped his brass cogs and scrambled behind his mother's legs. She didn't touch your ship, Miller, Arthur said. The gravel in his voice hardened into concrete. Now back off. Miller ignored him. He liked this. The power trip. The cheap thrill of making something else cower. He stepped closer to Ruth, looming over her hunched form. Look at the dirt on it, Miller said. He kicked out, his steel-toed boots smashing into the pile of sorted wires near Ruth's knees. Red and blue synthetic casing scattered across the floor. Hey, Bug, you understand me. You belong in the lower levels with the rest of the trash, not stinking up a human shop. Ruth's throat clicked rapidly in distress. Apologies, she rasped softly, her head bowed. I will clean. She reached out with a trembling lower hand to gather the wires. Miller laughed, a wet, ugly sound. He shifted his weight, pulling his heavy boot back. He was aiming for her reaching hand, or maybe the kid cowering behind it. He never followed through. Clang! A 3-pound, solid steel hydrospanner slammed into the Durasteel wall exactly 1 inch from Miller's nose. The impact was deafening. Sparks showered over Miller's shoulder as the heavy tool ricocheted and crashed to the floor grates. Miller yelped. He stumbled backward, his face instantly draining of colour, hands flying up to protect his head. Arthur stood rigid behind the counter. His chest was heaving. His right arm was still raised. He hadn't weighed the consequences. He hadn't thought about the lost credits. He had just seen the boot pull back, felt a hot spike of absolute, unadulterated fury pierce his decades of apathy, and thrown the heaviest piece of metal within reach. The silence in the shop rushed back in, broken only by Miller's ragged breathing. The captain lowered his hands, staring at the dent in the wall. Shock warped quickly into rage. "Are you out of your damn mind, Pendleton?" he screamed, spit flying. "I could have you arrested. I spend good credits here." Arthur walked slowly around the counter. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked entirely dead inside. He stopped by the fallen spanner, picked it up, and tapped the heavy steel head rhythmically against his palm. Smack, smack, smack. "You do spend good credits here," Arthur said. His voice was terrifyingly calm. "Which is the only reason you're walking out of here with your kneecaps intact." Miller sputtered, backing toward the door. "You're defending a tick? Over a paying customer?" "I'm defending my mechanic," Arthur corrected, stepping into Miller's personal space. The cheap cologne made him want to gag. "She's got more talent in her lower left claw than your entire engineering crew. She works hard, and she doesn't try to kick kids. Get out." "You're dead, old man," Miller spat, scrambling for the door release. "You'll be blacklisted. The guild will freeze you out." "Good. Get out." The hydraulic door hissed shut, sealing Miller out in the smog. Arthur let out a long, shaky breath. The adrenaline crashed, leaving his bad back screaming and his hands trembling. "You idiot," his brain whispered. "You're going to starve." He turned around. Ruth had stood up. She towered over him, but her 4 hands were clasped tightly to her chest. Her black compound eyes were fixed on him, entirely unreadable. "Arthur," her raspy voice broke, "you should not. He will hurt your business. "You should have let him strike me." Arthur scoffed, tossing the spanner onto a bench. He grabbed a bottle of synthetic water from the fridge and took a long, shaky drink. "Nobody kicks my employees, Ruth. Bad for morale." From behind her legs, Sammy slowly peeked out. The little alien scurried forward, picked up the scattered wires, and meticulously placed them back into a neat pile. Arthur watched the kid. A reluctant, tired smile touched the corners of his mouth. He was broke. He was probably blacklisted. But as he looked at the mother and child, safe in the warm glow of his shop, he realized he didn't care about the lost credits. For the first time in 20 years, Arthur felt like he was fixing something that actually mattered. The silence of a working shop was a symphony. The hum of the arc welder, the rhythmic tapping of a ball-peen hammer, the sharp hiss of a pressurized coolant flush. Arthur loved that noise. It meant money. It meant survival. The silence of a dead shop, however, was a suffocation. It had been 10 days since the hydrospanner incident with Miller, and Arthur's salvage and drive was bleeding out. Miller hadn't just complained to the local transport guild. He had thrown a tantrum. He called in favours. Suddenly, the steady trickle of independent haulers and corporate puddle jumpers simply stopped. The intake bay remained stubbornly closed. Dust began to settle on the primary workbenches. Arthur sat at his cluttered desk, staring at the cracked screen of his datapad. The harsh blue light illuminated the deep, dark bags under his eyes. Rent was due in 48 hours. The numbers on the ledger glared back at him in a violent, uncompromising red. He was short, not by a little, by a lot. He rubbed his face, his calloused palms scraping against 2 days of grey stubble. The shop was cold. He had dialed back the industrial heater to save on power consumption, and the chill of Port Meridian was creeping through the floor grates, settling into the marrow of his bones. Across the room, Ruth sat in her usual corner. She had run out of wire to strip 3 days ago. Now she was dismantling an entirely rusted, unsalvageable Mark IV navigation buoy Arthur had pulled from the scrap heap 5 years prior. It was busy work. They both knew it. Arthur watched her lower hands deftly unthread a corroded bolt. Her movements were slower now. The atmosphere of impending ruin hung heavy over the room, and she felt it. She wasn't stupid. She knew the shop was empty because of her, or rather, because Arthur had chosen her over a paying bigot. Arthur felt the familiar ugly prickle of resentment. "You brought this on yourself," a cynical voice whispered in his head. "You should have kept your mouth shut. You should have let Miller kick her." He looked at the red numbers on the screen. He imagined the corporate enforcers coming to change the locks, tossing his life's work into the acid rain. His chest tightened. He felt a sudden, irrational urge to yell, to throw something else, to blame the alien sitting quietly in the corner. Then Sammy scampered into view. The little boy was carrying a heavy, discarded plasma coupling, a solid piece of tungsten almost as big as his own torso. He waddled over to his mother, his 4 legs clicking against the metal floor, and proudly deposited the chunk of metal at her knees. He chirped, a soft, happy sound, completely oblivious to the financial doom hanging over their heads. Ruth paused her work. She reached out with an upper arm and gently stroked the hardening mottled grey plates of her son's head. Arthur let out a long, ragged exhale. The resentment dissolved, leaving behind nothing but a profound, aching exhaustion. He wouldn't change a damn thing. He'd throw the spanner again. He'd aim for Miller's teeth next time. "Stop stripping that buoy, Ruth," Arthur rasped, his voice sounding like sandpaper. "It's junk. Hasn't had a viable part in it since the last planetary war." Ruth froze. Her compound eyes slowly turned toward him. "I must work, Arthur. I cannot sit idle." "We're wasting power running the tools on dead scrap," Arthur said, tossing the datapad onto the desk. It clattered against a half-empty mug of cold synth caf. He leaned back in his chair, wincing as his lumbar spine popped. "Take a break." Ruth stood up. She didn't look relieved. She looked terrified. In her experience when the work stopped, the beatings or the evictions began. She wrapped her upper arms around herself, a gesture of deep discomfort. I have something else, she said. Her raspy voice was barely above a whisper. I have been working on it. When you were sleeping in the chair, Arthur frowned. Working on what? Ruth gestured toward the back of the shop, near the sealed hazard storage locker. She walked over, her heavy legs moving with deliberate slowness, and pulled away a heavy oil-stained canvas tarp. Arthur pushed himself out of his chair and limped over. When he saw what lay beneath the tarp, his breath hitched. It was a Class A sub-light fusion manifold. These were military-grade components, usually ripped out of decommissioned deep space cruisers. Arthur had bought the casing 6 months ago from a shady scrapper, intending to strip it for its palladium core. It had been a cracked, fused, useless hunk of slag, a paperweight. But it wasn't a paperweight anymore. The scarred outer casing had been meticulously buffed and realigned. The burned-out injection ports were replaced with hand-machined alternatives fashioned from scrap piping. The internal wiring, miles of microscopic fibre optics, had been completely rethreaded. It hummed with a faint, dormant energy. "What the hell is this?" Arthur breathed, stepping closer. The smell of fresh soldering flux and ozone hung sharply in the air. The casing was damaged, but the core geometry was stable, Ruth explained, stepping back to give him room. Her lower hands twitched nervously. "I utilized the discarded coils from the transport thrusters you deemed broken. I rerouted the plasma flow to compensate for the fractured intake valves. It is crude. The human schematics are inefficient, but it will achieve 94% optimal output." Arthur dropped to his knees, ignoring the sharp spike of pain in his joints. He ran a grease-stained thumb over the resoldered connection points. They were flawless. Microscopic perfection. A human engineer with a laser scalpel couldn't have done a cleaner job. He looked up at her. "You rebuilt a Class A manifold from absolute garbage." Ruth lowered her head. "I am sorry if I overstepped. I used your flux wire and 2 spools of copper. I will work without pay to replace the cost." "Without pay?" Arthur barked a laugh, a dry, shocked sound that echoed in the empty shop. He slapped the top of the manifold, the metal ring solid and true. "Ruth, if this thing holds a charge, it's worth 20,000 credits on the black market." "Hell, it's worth 15 grand legitimate." Her antennae twitched upright. "It will hold a charge. I tested the electromagnetic field. It is tight." Arthur stared at the machine. Then he looked at Ruth. The hunched, beaten refugee who had begged in the acid rain was gone. Standing there was a master technician who had just single-handedly pulled them back from the brink of the abyss. "Get my coat," Arthur said, scrambling to his feet. Adrenaline surged through him, chasing away the cold. "And get a diagnostic pad. We're firing this beauty up. If she purrs, I know a guy down on level 9 who buys heavy ordnance. We're going to make rent." The buyer's name was Caldwell. He was a freelance blockade runner who transported things the corporate authorities explicitly forbade. He stood in the center of Arthur's freezing shop, his heavy leather coat smelling of stale ozone, staring skeptically at the fusion manifold sitting on the diagnostic bench. "Word on the concourse is you've gone soft, Pendleton," Caldwell said. His mechanical left eye whirred audibly, clicking as its aperture dilated. "Heard you threw in with the local bugs. Gild's got a freeze on your bay." Arthur leaned against the counter, trying to project a relaxed confidence he absolutely did not feel. If Caldwell walked, they were dead. "Miller's a loudmouth. You want a manifold that will push a heavy freighter past a corporate checkpoint before their scanners even ping you? This is it." Caldwell snorted. He ran a handheld scanner over the casing. "Looks like a Frankenstein job. I see commercial hauler intake valves and hand-twisted copper. I hit Mach 4, this thing turns my engine room into a localized sun." "It won't," a raspy voice echoed from the shadows. Caldwell jumped, his hand dropping instinctively toward the heavy blaster strapped to his thigh. Ruth stepped out from the back corridor. She wasn't hunching anymore. She walked fully upright, her thick grey carapace gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. She didn't cower. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, stopping right beside the workbench. Caldwell stared, his mechanical eye buzzing rapidly as it adjusted to the sight of an alien in a human repair shop. "You let it speak?" he asked Arthur, his tone dripping with disgust. Arthur's jaw tightened. "She's my chief engineer. Her name is Ruth, and she built that manifold." Caldwell laughed harshly. "A tick built a Class A core? Prove it. Tell me why those rigged intake valves won't blow under pressure." Ruth didn't look to Arthur for permission. She reached out with an upper hand and tapped the diagnostic screen. "Human engineering relies on brute force," Ruth stated, her dry, scraping voice filling the room. "You push plasma through linear channels. It creates immense kinetic friction. The valves fail because you fight the energy." She used her lower hands to type rapidly, pulling up a glowing 3D wireframe on the monitor. "I realigned the magnetic containment field into a toroidal spiral," she explained, pointing at the blue schematic. "The plasma does not push, it cycles. The copper wiring creates a localized dampening field. It will not detonate, Captain Caldwell. It will run 40 degrees cooler than a factory model, and it will give you a 12% increase in thrust efficiency." Caldwell stared at the schematic. The shop was dead silent except for the soft whir of his eye. He reached out, touching the casing, feeling the subtle, contained vibration of the core. 12%, he murmured. 14, if your nav computer can handle the telemetry, Ruth corrected bluntly. Caldwell looked at Arthur. The disdain vanished, replaced by the calculating hunger of a man who just found gold in a gutter. 10,000 credits, Caldwell offered. Arthur pushed himself off the counter. The tension in his chest snapped into fiery leverage. 18,000, and you don't tell anyone where you got it. Caldwell glared. 15, and I bring my ship to your secondary bay at 0200 hours. You install it. Deal, Arthur said, extending a grease-stained hand. Caldwell shook it, his grip like a vice, then walked out. The heavy door hissed shut. Arthur stared at the door, then down at his datapad. 15,000 credits. Rent was covered for 6 months. They could buy real food. He turned around. Ruth was standing by the bench, her 4 hands resting gently on the cool metal of the manifold. Her chest heaved slightly, the adrenaline wearing off. He was arrogant, Ruth rasped, her antenna twitching in amusement. He did not understand the magnetic spiral. Most humans don't, Arthur admitted. He grabbed 2 bottles of synthetic water from the fridge, tossing one to her. She caught it effortlessly. "You didn't back down." "You did not back down from the man with the heavy boots," Ruth replied softly. She looked toward the back, where Sammy was asleep on a pile of blankets. "You gave us a door. I must ensure it stays open." Arthur took a long drink. He felt the ache in his knees, the permanent kink in his spine, the heavy weight of 54 years. But as he looked around the cluttered shop, it felt different. It wasn't just a place to survive anymore. "All right," Arthur sighed, pushing himself off the wall. "We've got an installation at 0200. Let's prep the hydraulic lifts. It's going to be a long night." Ruth nodded. She didn't say thank you. She just picked up a hydro spanner and walked toward the bay with quiet dignity. Arthur watched her go. He picked up his own wrench, feeling the familiar, comforting weight of the steel. Nobody hired the poor alien widow. The galaxy looked at her and saw trash. Arthur looked at her and saw the best mechanic on Port Meridian. And for the first time in a long time, he knew they were going to be just fine. If Arthur and Ruth's story struck a chord with you, don't let it end here. Hit that like button to support more gritty, grounded sci-fi tales, share this video with a fellow fan of HFY, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a chapter. Have you ever taken a chance on someone when the rest of the world looked away? Let me know down in the comments below. See you in the next one.